All right, good morning to everyone. Welcome back to docket number 210515 REO3. We're here for our third reopener in our performance-based regulation framework dockets. This one focused on integrated distribution system planning. So I want to welcome everyone to today's technical meeting. We do have an agenda in front of us today with a series of presentations. We have time for stakeholder questions after we get through some peer staff questions. If you've had a chance to look at the agenda, we are trying not to take a lunch break as it seems like we might be able to finish beforehand. But if we run into folks with a ton of questions, like we can certainly stay flexible here. In terms of opening announcements, before I'll give our colleagues over at Eversource and UI a couple minutes to get settled here, as they will be on the virtual stage in just a moment. In terms of opening announcements or administrative matters from the authority, just a couple of our usual ones. We are live streaming to YouTube, where you can go back and reference this later. We also have a court reporter with us, so please make sure that you are identifiable by name and affiliation. Because of our desire to keep the record clear and robust, we do ask that you refrain from using the chat function and instead raise any questions or comments that you have verbally today during the meeting. If at any time you'd like to be recognized, we ask that you locate the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen and locate the raise hand function there, which we will be using for our questions queue later on in today's proceeding. Additionally, I want to recognize that the authority, as we made notice in the docket, has retained an engineering consultant to assist us with the remainder of this docket, and that consultant is the company Internex. So we want to welcome the folks from Internex who are joining us today to begin listening into the presentations, and look forward to everyone's continued engagement. So without further ado, do want to welcome our teams from Eversource and UI for their joint presentation. I do believe we have the slide deck and we're happy to control. I see a couple of the presenters already. Mr. Freeman, you're first up. Actually, I think maybe Dr. Walker's first up on my screen, but I don't think he's presenting. So Mr. Freeman, I will turn it over to you to get us started here. And if you'd let us know if you'd like Ms. Lupley to control the slides.
So Chairman, actually my colleague from UI, Mr. Cruz, will be leading off.
Great,
Sure.
Mr. Cruz, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. We prefer you guys share the presentation, please. Perfect. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Lucas Cruz. I am the manager of the distribution system planning team at UI. And joining me today are Lavelle Freeman, director of system planning for the distribution team at Eversource. Also, Maritza Estremera, program manager for non-wire solutions at UI. And Jeff Shi, project manager of engineering, advanced forecasting and modeling at Eversource. And together we will present this joint presentation that was filed by both EDCs. Lavelle and I will begin with the integrated system planning section, followed by Maritza and Jeff, who will discuss the non-wire solutions program. Next slide, please. Okay. This slide shows the integrated system planning process diagram. Here we want to summarize how the integrated system planning works in both EDCs, from inputs that we consider in planning, how we identify the system needs with an integrated approach, and how solutions are developed. Investments amounts are estimated and approved with the regulator, and also receive internal approvals. So starting on the left side of this slide, we have the planning drivers, which include new customer requests And these, when we say new customer requests, these can be either new loads or load additions requests, and also new DRs of all types. We also consider beneficial electrification plans and clean energy objectives as well. Then both EDC's teams conduct interconnection studies and develop future load forecast scenarios for their territories, and all of these based on our inputs, the inputs that we receive. The planning teams also consider resilience, reliability, safety standards, and design criteria to ensure compliance with all EDC's procedures. And then using these inputs, also inputs from the interconnection studies, the planning teams perform distribution performance and condition assessments to identify reliability and resilience needs based on asset condition, health, age, and also the asset operational performance. Our teams also assess capacity needs based on load growth demand, electrification needs, and also DR penetration. Then our planning teams also assess the system for power quality as part of the distribution system analysis that we perform. From all these assessments in the middle part of the slide, we identify our system needs, and the solutions developed the solutions development process begins as soon as we identify the system needs. As part of this process, many alternatives are considered, and the most cost-efficient solutions are selected. For example, if we identify a capacity constraint, our teams always try to use existing infrastructure, such as circuit ties and switches, existing switches, to shift load from overloaded areas to areas with more available marginal capacity. With that, we could defer the need for more expensive projects, such as developing new feeders, upgrading substation transformers, etc. We only recommend new feeders, substation transformers, replacement when a larger area is already compromised with load growth. And then we are lacking basically options to shift loads around and better accommodate the load growth. So sometimes we need also to recommend new feeders and substation replacement as part of the solutions development. And lastly, we move to the process of obtaining regulatory approvals for future investments. We also define cost recovery and finally implement these projects. Next slide, please. So this slide focuses on the integrated grid needs assessment. As we discussed in previous technical sessions, this is not a single assessment, but a combination of many grid assessments and studies that are triggered in a predetermined frequency and also as needed basis. Sometimes we see the need to develop a specific study, and we do so. For example, capacity assessments are conducted in an annual basis to review the seasonal peak loads around our circuits and substations. And also we update the load growth forecast to proactively plan for capacity in certain areas. And with that, avoiding delays in beneficial electrification plans, for example. If a substation is projected to exceed its rating in the coming future, we can trigger the development of a comprehensive area study, for example, because in comprehensive area study, we consider multiple factors, not just capacity. So we make sure that once we go to an area, we comprehensively assess the needs and develop integrated solutions for all the needs in that area. Similarly, interconnection studies may reveal reliability or power quality needs in certain locations, and this can trigger other types of studies as well. These studies and assessments help us to develop integrated solutions, as I said, and with that we can address multiple needs in specific areas of our service territory. Once solutions receive internal and external approvals, they are included in the company's approved capital plan for execution. Next slide, please. The integrated system planning teams also collaborates with many business areas within the EDC's organization. For example, we work closely with key account managers to account for future spot loads in our studies. Also, we work with the asset management teams for inputs on asset health scores. Also, the energy efficiency and regulatory teams to align our projections with policy and state goals. And the distribution engineering team as well to develop detailed engineering designs and cost estimates for our solutions. These business areas and other also listed in this slide are crucial to the planning functions to work properly, as we interact with them on a daily basis. Next slide, please. This slide provides more details on how our planning teams interact with other business areas. As I said, these interactions are crucial for the IDSP to function effectively. So we interact with for advanced forecasting teams, the DER team as well, the DER interconnection. We also have interactions with the transmission system planning to make sure that we have integrated solutions for both systems, transmission and distribution. Next slide, please. Also, both EDCs have internal planning and engineering standards and criteria. Our engineers use these guides and procedures to direct their work on a daily basis. Pretty much every day they are using these guides, and also these guides are utilized by many other teams within our business. So these guides are shared with distribution engineering, also with other departments that are involved in this process. And I believe many of these procedures and guides were already shared in other dockets and also in this docket previously. Next slide, please. Yeah, regarding evaluation methods, we presented in more details these evaluations in previous technical sessions, but pretty much our planning engineers, they create network models in our PowerFlow software to simulate future conditions of connecting new loads, adding loads as well, and also adding DERs to the system. They evaluate thermal impacts, reverse power flow on substation transformers, impacts to voltage, short circuit impacts, also the risk of islanding, transient overvoltage, and reliability and resiliency impacts, and many other aspects listed here. The evaluation framework can encompass different aspects depending on the type of load, on the type of DER that is being evaluated as well. Each case is unique and is studied by our planning experts. Next slide, please. So at this point, I will hand it over to my colleague Lavelle to present the following slides.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cruz, and good afternoon, everyone. So Mr. Cruz presented a really good overview of the interconnected nature of our teams, regardless of whether it's UI, Eversource, or any other EDC. Integrated distribution planning is by nature a collaborative exercise, and the teams are organized and structured in that way. Within both our organizations, we have made particular effort to harmonize the transmission and the distribution planning organizations, because we have found, and this is true regardless of the size of the project, that you cannot really execute any distribution substation project of any size unless the transmission sources are there. And oftentimes the transmission is the bottleneck to getting the distribution substation implemented. So over the years, we have, and just before I forget, I know that you have given us several prompts, Chairman, and we have attempted, we are attempting to address these as we go to the presentation, perhaps not explicitly by tying a particular prompt to a particular slide, but in the flow of the presentation, I hope we address every single question. If not, we'd be very happy to take those after the presentation. So as I was saying, over the years, we've made a particular effort to harmonize the transmission and distribution teams from a functional perspective, but even also from a locational perspective. My colleague, the Director of Transmission System Planning, sits right next to me, and we talk on a daily basis. And as we do bottoms-up planning for load growth, for DER activity on the distribution side, we identify the constraints and we develop and plan new distribution solutions. And I will talk a little bit more about how we develop these solutions. But suffice it to say, as we develop the solutions, there is a requisite load demand from the forecasting team that influences that. There is energy efficiency interplays, solar PV, and the ability to offset loads at particular times, electric vehicle demand, and all these are impacting the system at a feeder level and roll up to the substation level. And based on these and based on the tools that we use and the processes that Mr. Cruz outlaid in the previous slide, the evaluation processes, we identify the distribution constraints. And these constraints are typically thermal capacity constraints for equipment, whether it's a distribution line or a transformer, voltage constraints of a steady state nature, which we call the ANSI 84 standards. We are seeing more transient over voltage constraints, which is a new phenomenon in distribution planning, but we are seeing that because of high penetration of DER and power quality constraints, and of course, reliability. All these constraints are evaluated, and we identify the need to expand or implement new distribution solutions. And as we do this, as we implement new solutions, these solutions create additional capacity for demand, for more load, for more DER. And these more additional load and DER, as well as the ones that are connected, create demand on the transmission system. And so from a transmission perspective, we roll all this up, all of the distribution substation demands roll up to the transmission system. We perform similar analyses on the transmission side using similar tools to identify transmission constraints and to identify lines that need to be upgraded, maybe new transmission stations that need to be sited. And so this all, and it can be iterative, because we can, from a transmission need, we can reflect that back down to the distribution system and inform the sizing and location of distribution assets. So it's very, it's an imperative that these teams work together extremely closely to prevent a harmonized view of integrated planning for all customers. Next slide, please, Ms. Lupoli. So as part of the transmission grid needs assessment that I just mentioned, large load, including DERs, installed DERs, and forecasted DERs, which are a component of the regional ISO New England forecast. All these are modeled in the transmission grid needs assessments, and we use these to evaluate the current and the future impacts on the system. And knowing that DER generally acts as a load reducer, depending on how it's coincident with the peak loads. PSSE is typically used at Eversource. I suspect UI uses the same tool for grid needs assessments. And these identify the constraints of the system. From a DER side specifically, we perform transmission system impact studies. These are required by the ISO New England, typically for DER that's larger than 1 megawatt. And they're used to evaluate the impact of integrated DER on the transmission system. It's very difficult for individual DER to really cause transmission constraints, but in aggregate, when you consider the hundreds of megawatts, gigawatts of DER, at some point they begin to impact the transmission system from a reverse flow perspective, but also from a stability perspective, if they all begin to, say, chip off at the same time. And so the objective of the SIS is to demonstrate that DER individually and in aggregate do not cause adverse significant impact to the reliability and the operating characteristics of the transmission system, or to that of a market participant. And one of the key requirements of these studies, which are also called ASO studies, affected system operator studies, one of the key requirements is that a DER developer cannot receive an interconnection agreement without having one of these studies performed, if it is applicable to their system. And so it's very important that we coordinate the distribution SIS with the transmission ASO study, so that customers can receive the ISAs in an expedient fashion. So the proactive and coordinated planning is imperative, both for loads and for DER, so that we can understand from a cohesive nature what the system requirements are. Next slide, please. So on the distribution side, we have an annual planning cycle, and most utilities engage in this type of exercise annually. And this is mostly related to load, I must clarify. DER projects don't typically have an annual cycle. These come in all throughout the year, and we study them on a sequential basis, first come, first served, or if there's a group study order, we group them and study them. So that's done throughout the year. From a capacity, a load serving capacity standpoint, our annual planning process begins after the summer peak period. We identify what the summer load is. Distribution system analyzes the loads, determine the yearly peaks, accounting for DG, for energy efficiency, for load transferred, and other exogenous impacts. And this typically occurs in the third quarter of each year. And we tend to collect all the step loads also during this third quarter. Our account executives working very closely with large customers, working with cities and planning departments, collect this information. And so we typically have this on hand by third quarter, no later than the fourth quarter, as an input into the forecasting process, which typically occurs in the first quarter of each year. The load forecast develops the 10-year outlook for loads, accounting for weather impacts and new step loads, econometric trends, EE, DE, DER, EV, as I mentioned. And when this is completed somewhere around the first quarter, towards the end of the first quarter of each year, it's sent to the planning teams and back for us to now begin to perform these grid needs studies to understand what the constraints are, capacity, voltage, reliability violations, and to develop long-term planning solutions, including looking at what non-wires alternative solutions are applicable to resolve the identified needs. And this typically occurs during the second quarter and the third quarter of each year. And once these solutions are developed, distributed system planning works with other teams that Mr. Cruz identified earlier: asset management, grid mod, engineering, to initiate the projects, to develop engineering designs, cost estimates, and to execute the solutions. And on the next slide, I will talk a little bit more about that process. Thank you. So the process really begins with the system needs, which I just went through. And these have several stakeholders, the technical stakeholders, which are typically distribution system planning, in some cases transmission planning, and asset management for projects that have an asset health or safety or obsolescence requirements. Key stakeholders are also the financial groups within our individual utilities and the executives who champion these projects. The system needs result in origination or initiation of projects, and these are again developed by the system planning organization or the asset management organization if there's an asset health component. We typically prepare forms. In Eversource, it's called a solution selection form. I'm sure there's a different term at UI used for the same form, but this form basically documents all of the needs that the project would resolve in enough detail to give the reviewers information to assess whether the project solution would meet the need and to assess whether there are other needs that can be co-optimized with the need that the project is designed to resolve. The technical solutions are evaluated by a technical committee within each utility, and then these typically move to another stage of higher fidelity engineering and cost estimation, and then the result goes to the financial team to decide and approve the project funds, either partially or full, for execution, and then which then goes to the project management team to execute. This is a very structured process. It's called Eversource is called the Eversource Capital Project Approval Process, probably the same name at UI, different teams, same functions, but it's designed to ensure that all considerations, whether they be environmental, whether they be policy, whether they be technical, are considered, and also to ensure that other needs within the enterprise in the same area are considered, such that we don't go touch a substation and upgrade it for capacity and not address a pending obsolescence or asset condition need at the same substation, requiring us to go several years and touch the same substation. So if we have a project, it is imperative that we collect all the needs and co-optimize the needs such that we're doing the most cost-effective activities for customers in every location. Next slide, please. This slide captures how we go about developing solutions for the needs. We employ a number of data analytics and tools, leveraging traditional and non-traditional input. So, input from the GIS, traditional things like the demand, but we also look at solar irradiance to understand what the gross load is if we remove the DER component. If, for example, DER doesn't have a stellar day, it's a cloudy day, it's overcast, you don't have a lot of solar, what could we expect to see from a demand perspective? So we reveal the true nature of demand. We look at socio-economic data to understand the drivers for load in the future, travel patterns to understand where DER would be, not DER, where EV would be charging at what substations and how those would affect the demand of the substation. Parcel data to understand the potential for DER to develop in substation locations. So when we're sizing the substation, we understand what the future drivers would be. And importantly, as part of our forecast, we look at the long-term demand assessment. So we forecast for 10 years, but then we look at what is the impact of policy on the demand beyond 10 years. If there's electrification, drivers, decarbonization policies, greenhouse gas emissions policies, that would in the future create additional demand in a substation location, then when we are looking at solutions, we would understand how to design the substation to be expandable. We may not build the substation for that demand beyond 10 years, but we build a station so that it could be easily, in quotes, easily expanded for demand beyond the 10 years. So that informs our planning now. The solution alternatives are usually varied in terms of the complexity and how they're applied. It can begin with balancing load across the system. For, if you have a couple of megawatts of thermal capacity violation, maybe if you balance the load, you can get a little more out of your system without expensive upgrades. Again, replacing, upgrading, limiting equipment such as cables, conductors, maybe upsizing the transformer. Adding new equipment or expanding the substation would be the next step if you really can't balance the load, transfer to other substations, replace minor equipment. Then you may need to add new transformers, for example, and that becomes a more expensive proposition. Apply non-wires solutions, either as a mitigation measure or as a bridge to wires solution. And the bridge to wire solution basically is speaking to the fact that it takes a long time to build a new substation, for example, or to expand the substation. And so in the interim, before we get to that point, you may need a solution to bridge that gap. And so maybe a battery storage project in a strategic location allows you to be able to offload the transformer during a peak load period. And so the bridge to wires is a viable tool in our bag of tricks, so to speak. And building new substations tend to be the last resort. But really, when we look at the solutions, we understand that we would apply solutions starting with a less complex solution and moving to the more complex ones. But we also take stock of the long-term needs of the system. And if a less complex, cheaper solution does not meet the long-term need and requires us in a short time to implement a more expensive solution, then we would do a benefit cost analysis to understand, based on the time value of money, whether it's more cost effective to do the long-term solution now or to do a series of short-term solutions. So there's a science, there is a rigorous evaluation behind these solutions before we get to the end state. The solution selection is a complex process involving several groups to select the preferred solution in compliance with external, very rigorous internal and external stakeholder requirements. And of course, some of these solutions would require them to go through a regulatory approval. For example, large substation or transmission projects may have to go through a siting board requirement. And of course, there's prudence review at the end of it. And so with that in mind, we're really sticklers about how we go about developing solutions and how we document those solutions. Next slide is lovely, which I think is my final slide. This slide is similar to a slide I presented a couple of slides back, but it pictorially presents this capital project approval process. The top portion shows that system planning is normally involved with, which is a need identification, preparing of initial funding requests for us to begin doing a conceptual level estimation and developing the documents that go to the technical approval committees. The middle one is really an encapsulation of the entire process. And it shows that system planning would typically work with other teams to develop that conceptual grade estimate. And the conceptual grade estimate incorporates designs from our standards library, which Mr. Cruz spoke about earlier, to develop the scope and the major equipment for all the alternatives under consideration. We perform and coordinate the conceptual engineering with a number of teams to identify key project risks and the appropriate level of detail with respect to the constructability of the solution, with respect to line routing, with respect to outage planning, and possible single contingency loss of load. If you have a loss of an element, are you able to serve our customers still? Or do you need to bring in mobile transformer or backup generation to do that? We look at the applicable mitigation actions to resolve that. What are the siting and permitting requirements? What are the environmental impacts? Importantly, what are the community and external stakeholder impacts, particularly on environmental justice and disadvantaged communities? And how do we decide control and procure equipment? All of these are included in looking at the conceptual design. And we developed the strategies and the mitigation risk and a conceptual grade estimate to a -25 plus 50% level for all competitive alternatives, including non-wire solutions. And then if it's not a competitive, which normally looked at a -50% plus 200% level. After the conceptual engineering is performed and the alternatives are developed, these alternatives are vetted by a technical committee. At Eversource, it's called a solution design committee. It's called something else at UI, but it's the same concept. To look at all of the solutions and they understand how the solutions are coordinated, what are the co-optimization opportunities, and ultimately whether the solutions, especially the preferred solution, meets the need. Once this is done, a preliminary engineering design is developed for the preferred solution. And that includes a constructability review, evaluation of the right-of-way, some environmental mapping, some preliminary three-line diagrams, development of the substation control, enclosure layout, underground planning and profile. Many of these activities are coordinated and developed to present to the financial committee for approval of the project. Now, the bottom line is a number of committees, a number of groups, a number of very dedicated personnel within each utility collaborating and coordinating on the integrated plan to ensure that the final distribution solution meets the long-term need in a reliable manner with the minimum impact on the environment and also at the lowest possible cost for ratepayers. And that is our mission, and that is how we organize to fulfill that mission. So with that, I will pass it over to my colleague. I'm not sure if it's Mr. Shi or
Yes.
Maritza. Okay, Jeff?
Thank you, Lavelle. Yep, that's me. Good morning, everyone. So next slide, please. And thank you, folks, for attending today's tech session. So next slide, please. So I will start talking about the NWS program and its design. So to begin with, I would like to first kind of provide a background for what is the NWS project and provide some of our definition here along with the example. So for EDC's perspective, NWS project, non-wire solutions projects, that the project that defers, avoid, or reduce a traditional capital investment in the distribution system for a period of time. So through an alternative technologies, and this technology can include, we would know the DER, distributed energy resources. We have listed some example here. So the DG storage, demand response program, energy efficiency, grid software, and control resources. Next slide, please. So after level setting on those project and technology, we would like to go a little bit into the regulatory history of the NWS program. So basically, there are three phases. The first, from the left to the right here, the first one is docket number 171203 RE07. That is the point at the time that PURA has investigated into this topic, and it's began on June 22nd, 2020. This docket established a process for comparing potential NWS against traditional distribution system capacity upgrades and other utility expenses. So when we move into the middle, the second phase here is the docket number 240808. And this is like the stage that we just been through, and this the 240808 is the AWS program initiation phase. This is the phase where both Eversource and UI, the EDCs, have worked closely with Process Monitor MB5 and various stakeholders to develop an annual bidding and evaluation process through several of our stakeholder meetings. And this process just concluded last month on May 31st, 2024, with all documentations being developed by all parties, and we have filed and submitted to PURA. And now we move into the third phase here is, as folks probably all know, we're going to have upcoming tech sessions. The first one will start on June 20th, 2024. That will be next week. And EDCs, we would like to seek clarities on a range of concerns and issues in the current process proposal, as well as both EDCs legal consoles have some unresolved legal concerns with the NWS proposals that we hope to discuss further in this phase. Next slide, please. So I would like to talk about, in terms of the NWS process and projects, one of the key things we would like to look into is the suitability criteria of that. So here we leverage the REO7 final decision exhibit B here, the structure to help us to frame this suitability criteria here. So as you can see, there's an overarching high level criteria that is the for all the NWS project that's be like project to be over the cost threshold of $250,000. So under this overarching $250K project cost condition, there are three groups, three categories we have listed here. So the first one is the likely NWS solicitation opportunities. Those are the projects over 1 million. Projects that required for capacity, power quality, reliability, renewables, or distribution resources, integration, or resilience purpose. However, the EDC would like to note, even within this likely NWS solicitation opportunities, there are still use cases or cases where the NWS might not be suitable for that. And some of the examples are like the asset conditions, say you have strictly a pole replacement situation, then it's not really suitable for an NWS project. Or you have like a new load or new customer would like to interconnect it to our network, then it's also like a strictly a line issue and then not really suitable for NWS here. The second category here is the potential NWS solicitation opportunity, which is just the a project of between $500,000 to 1 million. And then let's move into the third one, which is the unlikely NWS solicitation opportunities. Still, the project costs over $250K because it's under the overarching criteria. However, those projects are deemed unlikely is because project needs that is, needs to be within the calendar year that ensure the continuous service or reliability. Hence, those projects we're going to deem that's not really likely for the AWS solicitation opportunity. So with that, I would like to transfer to Maritza to continue the second part of this AWS program deck. So
thank you, Jeff. Next slide, please. Thanks. So in this slide it's essentially a summary of what Lucas and Lavelle presented earlier in the presentation, and it's a high-level overview of our screening and our procurement process. In short, we identify a system need, and then we move on to the pre-screening criteria. Now, the pre-screening criteria are those items that Jeff just chatted about, which are the suitability criteria. If a project does not pass through the pre-screening criteria, we consider that as that the project fails out, and it's considered for a traditional wire solution. So as part of that pre-screening criteria, we're identifying if a project is likely, potential, or an unlikely NWS candidate. If a project is considered passes the pre-screening criteria, then it moves on to the detailed NWS screening process. That would consist of conceptual engineering. It would also help us determine, during that phase, we're also determining what kind of NWS technologies would potentially meet that system need. If we define during that process that there may or may not be a good candidate, the project might fail out and be considered for a traditional wire solution. However, if the project passes that detailed screening, we would consider the project for either an RFI, request for information, or a request for proposal. We go ahead and conduct those competitive solicitations. When we receive the bids back, we would review the bids for technical viability, financial viability, and also timing to determine if the timing identified as part of those bids would meet our needs. If they fail out, again, traditional wire solution would be considered, but if those bids would meet our needs, they then would be moved on to the next phase, which would be conducting the benefit cost analysis to determine if it would have a positive BCA, benefit cost analysis ratio. If it fails rather, again, traditional wire solution would be sought. However, if it passes, then we would move on to the award and implementation phase of the procurement process here. Next slide, please. Now that we've kind of chatted about our procurement process, we wanted to chat about our annual program or process structure. So the program in itself begins January 1st of 2025. The process monitor hired by Pura will be conducting quarterly stakeholder meetings throughout the year. But I did want to note that there are some key dates in here, which are the ones on the bottom of the slide here. Our very first annual filing that the EDCs have to submit is on February 8th of 2025, and then yearly afterwards. There will be sessions where the EDCs will be asked questions from both the process monitor and stakeholders pertaining to that grid needs filing, and then the anticipated decision date of the filing is expected sometime in mid-August. Next slide, please. In terms of if we define either a traditional wire solution or a non-wire solutions, cost recovery is important, right? So in terms of traditional wire solution, this remains the same. Essentially, we would recover any cost with a traditional wire solution via base rates once the project gets approved through a rate case proceeding. A non-wire solutions, however, can be recovered using two mechanisms. Non-capital expenditures would be recovered using the non-bypassable federally mandated charge, That is allowed in the interim while we get the project into a rate case. Once the project is included in a rate case and approved, then the project would then be covered using the base rates. And with that, that actually concludes the NWS segment of the presentation. And we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, which is just the questions slide. So we're open to any questions the audience may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our presenters this morning. We're going to start with questions from authority staff and specifically Mr. Kramer, and I'll invite other stakeholders. If you know that you're going to have questions for this team, to please go ahead and get into the queue by using the raise hand function at the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. And I will turn to stakeholders after we get through authority staff questions. Mr. Kramer, please.
Thank you, Chairman Gillette. And thank you to the UI and Eversource teams for the presentation today. A couple just clarifying questions first. Throughout the technical meeting series that we've had to date, Eversource and UI have presented separately and have taken just slightly different approaches to presenting their distribution system planning practices. And just for clarity in this meeting, is it the case that the companies are now stating that their practices are generally the same by sort of using the same materials to describe and recap the various IDSP steps that we've covered before?
So I'll just answer Mr. Kramer. So having sat through all of the presentations from both utilities and obviously participating in the Eversource presentation, it has not been my impression that we are dissimilar. In fact, I think we are very much aligned in planning practices. I think there are some slight differences, maybe in terms of how we organized. But at this point, we thought it would, yes, to your question, it would be good to present a unified front to show that really our practices and our standards are very similar.
And to add to what Mr. Freeman has said, especially since the topic of today's discussion was also around the non-wires alternative process, Mr. Kramer, which both of the companies are going through with the process monitor under 24808, it seemed to make sense since this is a standardized process for the state to do that as a singular presentation.
Thank you. That's helpful. Just, it may be the case that with some prior, variances or slight differences as you described them, Mr. Freeman, that we may need to clarify just as we move forward in the docket, where there are divergent practices versus where things are truly the same. But that's very helpful context, and I understand the approach. My second clarifying question is for the first half of the presentation, kind of recapping many of the aspects of the IDSP process that we've covered to date, where I guess are those slides intended to be indicative of the existing distribution system planning process absent the standardized non-wires solutions process, that's currently being established? I'm just trying to make sure that I understand if that's been accounted for in the way that those slides are presented, or are we looking at sort of past practice in the first half of the slides and then discussing how we're moving forward in the second half of the slides with the NWS process being established?
So if I may, the NWS process right now, it's mostly a procurement process, and not a process that prescribes how we implement or how we design or how we plan NWS as part of our distribution planning process. So the process to date has already incorporated how NWS would potentially contribute to resolving a violation. Now, where that NWA comes from, how it's administered, all that, I think that's that process. But the planning process itself is agnostic to that. And so what we've presented, I think, is a really good encapsulation of how NWS fits into our planning process.
And to add to what Mr. Freeman has said, Mr. Kramer, in full alignment with this, the company's already screened for NWAs, right? And we've had this discussion in this. I don't remember the was it 171203 RAO7? I might have the numbers wrong there. So a few dockets going on, and the companies had presented their processes, so we already have that gate in. Where we do screen for non-wires alternative. What we expect the change is going to happen, right, is that this newly established process, once it kicks off next year, would basically slot into that place. And as Mr. Freeman said, it mostly directs how we go about procurement of those NWAs.
Thank you. That's helpful, and I think answers my question. And just to check for my understanding that because there has been a process to evaluate solutions pre-existing at the EDCs, that's reflected in the processes that we've been looking at throughout the technical meetings to date. And now we're talking, as you're describing, about the non-wires process that's sort of being established as a part of the overall distribution system planning process.
Yes, that's correct. And this was a bit of the conundrum when we prepared for this is what do we present on, because the NWS process is established, but Pura isn't operational yet. Let's put it like that, right? But we know we already presented on our existing process, so this was kind of the split, split down the middle. We thought that would work well.
Thank you. For my next question, I wanted to just ask for a clarification on, if I may, the relationship between slides 11 and 18. So 11, as I understood it, describes the capital planning process. Generally looks at each of those steps in the diagram, and then slide 11 described the non-wires screening and procurement process specifically. And so if you could just help me place that non-wires screening and procurement process within the capital planning process described on slide 11, I would appreciate it.
Can we pull up slide 11? So I can start this, and then I would invite my colleagues at UI and Mr. Freeman to chime in. But essentially, as it stands right now, when we go for project authorization, we go through a non-wires or internal for a non-wires alternative screening process, and that's basically you see the nice marker there when that the yellow star, sorry, when that get cleared. So that's when that initial screening happens, whether there is a non-wires alternative that we should follow through on or not.
Right, that's correct. So at that gate, someone from UI was speaking. I don't want to.
Oh, no. I was just gonna elaborate a little bit more and just express, thanks, Lavelle, that ensure slide 18 would fall right in between where that star marker is. So we would identify the system need as part of the origination phase. Then if we determine and do the detailed screening that an NWS would be viable, we would do the procurement process as part of where this star is identified here on the screen. If we do get a positive BCA, then we move on to the technical component of it that you see here on the screen. So just wanted to elaborate there a little bit more that slide 18 is basically that star marker there.
That's correct. And I was going to tie this to slide 13. If you jump to slide 13, that star basically in the second diagram in the middle where you have that blue box that says NW screening, that's about where that star is. So the screening informs that project solution form that goes to the technical committee.
Thank you. That helps to connect the dots here for me among the various processes and the diagrams here. So I appreciate that clarification. For my next question, on slide 15, where Mr. Shi introduced the non-wire solutions program background, I apologize if I had missed this, but I'm hoping that you could give an example of other resources here. What if anything, in particular might qualify as an other resource evaluated or considered a non-wire solution outside of those others listed here?
Got it. So it's really basically you're trying to be technology agnostic here. So we don't know, like, you know, and obviously it's kind of like hard to list all the non-traditional wire solution technology here. So that's why we kind of, you know, we try to list some of it, but then we know there's still more others, could be commercially viable technology. That's why we listed here on other resources. So yeah, I mean, it's just it's a more of a general term to put it here, trying to make sure to show that we are willing to consider as long as the technology is commercially viable. You know, it's gonna be one of the technology or you know that we can consider.
Thank you, Mr. Shi. And just a follow-on question to that then would be the extent to which the companies are considering, and I know this is sort of looking into the future and it would depend on each individual grid need identified, but I'm curious the extent to which the companies are anticipating you know, portfolios of different non-wire solutions or different technologies. To your point about technology agnosticism, is it the case that the companies expect that a portfolio of different sort of technologies may in fact be appropriate to meet a particular grid need, as opposed to you know, one single solution?
Yes, yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I was going to just quickly, Mr. Kramer. Yes, so the short answer is yes, and the existing, even the existing in-house programs today, that's as we screen, allow for a portfolio of solutions, and so be that energy efficiency, demand response combined with something else, or solar combined with storage, or on-site generation combined with storage. Those are all combinations that are possible.
Thank you. The next question that I had was to move us up to slide 18, please. And here we got a nice overview of the non-wires screening and procurement process, and I'm hoping that we could get just a little more detail on the detailed non-wires screening step. We looked at some examples of the non-wires pre-screening categories, and I'd like just a little more discussion, please, on what is involved in the detailed screening step before moving to procurement.
Can I ask a question back quickly, Mr. Kramer? Are you interested in how we're doing it currently, or more about the future process that Pura has established in its order of 2022?
Yeah, a very appropriate clarifying question, and I think my answer is for both. And though you know, we have other dockets where those screening criteria being established, that's not all that information is in this record. And so to understand the detailed screening step, both existing and then as maybe modified in the process being established, would be helpful.
So I can quickly speak to, at least for Eversource, and I'll let UI then comment on their screening process as it exists today, on our detailed screening process. So the company has an in-house tool and framework that we developed, which allows us, after they pass the initial screening, to take a look at a time series load flow on the asset that is in question, be that a substation, be that a transformer, a line, you name it, and evaluate a portfolio of different non-wire solutions. So the first and highest priority objective is the technical feasibility of the non-wires alternative, right? We have a need that we need to address. So we typically go through all possible technologies that we have models for. This is solar storage. You saw the list earlier that we can assess. And then we do a financial assessment of those technologies. We typically pull in standardized, in the screening, standardized costs from example, NREL's is that the annual technology database, ATB, on what average costs for storage might look like for solar, etc., and feed that into the revenue requirements models to get side-by-side utility cost test of those solutions, be that the traditional or the non-wires. And then we look at how far out the non-wires could defer the need for the traditional upgrade. And that maybe you can, with energy efficiency, you can defer it, for example, for 2 or 3 years. And then you still need to do the normal upgrade. So you have a value of deferral that you calculate against the incremental revenue requirements impact from the non-wires alternative. And that's basically, we've developed a tool in-house for that goes through all of this. The engineers can go through this. This builds a record of the decisions that were made. And if something fails out of that, it goes back to the traditional solution. And today, if it doesn't fail out of it, then we go into procurement of that solution.
And let me add for UI, it's pretty much the same process. We consider battery storage solutions for all traditional distribution solutions, and our teams they work to price all the alternatives that are being evaluated to address the constraint that was identified, and we always select the most cost-efficient solution. So pretty much the solution that is technically feasible and also has the lowest cost possible.
And then, I mean, your second part. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mr. Kramer.
I was just, you were anticipating my follow-up.
And so for the proposed process, right? And this is, it's highlighted here. The authority established the likely, potential, and unlikely NWS criteria that go into the grid needs filing, depending on timelines and project volume in dollars. However, I don't believe, and I'm going to look at Marissa and Jeff to correct me if I'm wrong on this, that there has been any fixed, detailed screening process established past doing this grid needs filing and then taking these to RFP. And then it'll really highly depend, because this is part of the issue we see, but not going to go into the details here, but that'll depend on what comes back. Right? When in our process, we determine the non-wires technology, is that a battery? And we know exactly what we need in terms of size, capacity, technology that we're deploying, and we know how to evaluate that when, for example, we get a bid in. Now, with this new process, the range of technologies, as you alluded to earlier, under other technologies can be anything. So there is still some work to be done to figure out how that detailed screen then actually plays out, and what that selection looks like. And I think that's something we're probably going to touch on, or hopefully touch on, in the June 20th technical session.
Fair enough. Unless others wanted to add, I just was hoping to see if that was something that we could bring into the record here. But if that is still in development, that makes fine sense. Okay. One question, just maybe not to backtrack, but just to go to the tiers, or the likely, potential, and unlikely projects that Dr. Walker, you just mentioned. If the EDCs could give a quick overview of the type of projects that they expect to not be covered by those categories, or in other words, what types of projects, if you can characterize those types, would fall underneath that $250,000 threshold and therefore won't appear in the disclosure for non-wires and those criteria, or if there's something else other than just not meeting that threshold that you would expect would not be covered in what gets evaluated for non-wires alternatives.
That's an excellent question, and I don't actually think we have the right people on this call, because we have system planning here, and as Mr. Freeman can elaborate, mostly the projects we cover are the large capital projects at the substation level, none of which would fall under below the $250,000 mark. These are more distribution engineering projects that are likely to fall under that mark. I don't think, at least from Eversource, we have distribution engineering folks on the call. They will, however, be present. Yeah, I was going to say, they will, however, be present on next Thursday, specifically for this discussion. We have our folks from distribution engineering joining in, because the volume-wise, they have the most projects.
Yep. And I can give an example. And Mr. Cruz, I think he also works in distribution. I think it's part of his portfolio. But for example, trip savers, application of trip savers on distribution lines for reliability. It's an element that you probably know that it's unlike a fuse in that it can reclose. And so those will be below $250,000. They will be installed at discrete locations. We use lots of these, but every location is different. So every project is different, and each one would definitely be less than $250,000. That's an example.
Yep. Just to add to Mr. Freeman here, considering UI's distribution system, pretty much our circuits here are meshed together. We have like circuits with 2, 3, 4 ties. Most of the circuits are close to each other. So we have a lot of possibilities here to even create additional tie points, and a solution for a capacity project for a specific circuit could be just creating a new circuit tie, install a new switch, and this type of project, including labor, could cost around $100,000 and will likely be under the NWS threshold. But as Mr. Freeman said, if we don't have these possibilities in certain areas, and we need to expand the substation to build a new feeder or replace a substation transformer, then these projects will likely exceed the NWS threshold and will be evaluated in the NWS process.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz and Mr. Freeman. My last question is how the companies expect for IDSP to validate that a given non-wire solution mitigates the constraint that was identified.
So, question. I'm sorry, I'm going to pose it. Is this in the evaluation process before we deploy the technology? So if we're looking at a 4 megawatt battery and we want to make sure that this will be able to address this, or is this post-deployment over the next couple of years trying to understand, has this battery actually performed as it is supposed to?
Post-deployment, please.
So I'm going to start on this, and then Mr. Freeman and Mr. Cruz, please chime in. And we've discussed it at the beginning of the IDSP process of how we do our forecasts, and our forecasts always include last year's peak. All right, so last year's peak goes into the forecast process. So in a scenario where the NWS isn't deployed and forecast was made, one would expect, for example, that we follow an upward trend on load, which causes the need. And if an NWS, let's call it the battery, I'll take this as the best example, is deployed, what we expect to then be seeing is that our peaks either remain at level or are reduced by the amount that the battery promised that it can reduce that. Right? That would be one approach. But again, this is very technology specific, And the battery is probably the easiest one because any large scale battery will have SCADA readings for. So we know exactly how they dispatch and deploy. Where it gets a lot more murky is, for example, with energy efficiency programs, right? If you could imagine a scenario when targeted energy efficiency program gets deployed, but the peak is still going up. So what happened? Did the program not work, or did the load go up more than expected, but the program still worked, yet we still have a deficit? And with energy efficiency, it's very hard to measure that, right? So depending on the technology, some are a lot easier to verify than others.
Yeah, and just to add more color on the battery statement. So we do have 2 battery proposals, as you know, Mr. Kramer, in Connecticut. Originally 3, we filed 2. And as part of that proposal, we had to submit a measurement and verification section that describes how we would go about ensuring that the batteries meet the requirements for reliability and resiliency that we put in the proposal. And so this is, and even to add more, the battery project in another jurisdiction, Massachusetts, that we implemented at Provincetown, we have been gathering operational statistics on that battery, how often it operated, how many customers were saved from an outage, how much time it was able to peak load a substation. Those we've collected. And so we have the ability and we have some of the metrics defined, and certainly we could apply those to an NWA of a battery type going forward. But as Dr. Walker rightly said, some other NWA solutions are more difficult, but we would be happy to work with stakeholders and the authority to figure out what are the right metrics and what can we report to ensure that you are satisfied with meeting the requirements.
Great, thank you very much. And Chairman Gillette, that's all from me.
Very good. Then let's try to get through the 3 people in the queue before we transition to our next presentation. So we'll start with Mr. Walmsley, please.
Thank you, Chair Gillette. So my question was, I was really interested to hear about this co-optimization process that you do, Mr. Freeman, and how you essentially pull those items together. I guess I'm wondering, how do you define the range of projects that you're looking at concurrently? Is there a geographical scale or a temporal scale? And then as a follow-up, how do you report on that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Walmsley. So it's really a technical impact scale. So projects that are at substation. So if it's at the substation, that's a clear co-optimization opportunity. If the substations are technically dependent on each other, meaning if there's a failure at one substation and we have to transfer load to an adjacent substation to prevent interruptions of those customers, then there's an opportunity to co-optimize those substations so that the second station isn't compromised by a transfer of load, or we increase capacity and more what we call LCC, load carrying capacity, between the substations. So it's really about, are there interdependent technical requirements between the assets, and that reveals the opportunity for co-optimization. And in what we've seen with co-optimization at this point, and DER is a good example, we have seen clear examples of the ability to co-optimize DER projects with load projects, because we've seen that upgrading a substation for DER creates a commensurate increase in capacity for load, creates additional reliability, both at the substation and on the distribution feeder side. And so we can make a very clear case that some capacity projects may actually be delayed, deferred, maybe completely avoided because of the projects. And so that co-optimization works there. Your second question, and before I get off my thoughts, so again, and the other area co-optimization works well is with asset management projects. And we have several clear examples where when we're doing a capacity project, there is an associated asset health condition. Maybe one transformer needs to be replaced for capacity, A second transformer is exhibiting signs of gassing, aging, general malaise. And so a project that incorporates both needs and is done concurrently makes the most sense and is a judicious use of funds. And then the question of how do we track this and report it? So this is typically tracked and documented in the solution selection forms that go through the solution design committee. And so the opportunities for co-optimization and the projects that are being co-optimized, each project has a separate SSF, but the references to the other project that's being co-optimized is included in each SSF. So anyone who reads a SSF for the asset management project could understand that there's a concurrent capacity project that takes advantage of the fact that you're going to be taking equipment out of service, and you have a window of opportunity where you can do both projects, takes advantage of the fact that you can reduce the capital that's been spent by co-optimizing the projects. So this is typically captured in those forms. And I'll invite my colleague from UI to add any specific UI response.
No, you covered all the points.
Okay.
Is that the only follow-up is whether that is reported back to Pura, the actual process, or made available?
To my knowledge, unless it's specifically asked for, it's not reported. However, I know that on a yearly basis, we do submit our paths, our project. Oh, I'm having a brain freeze. Or project form. These are forms. I forget what PAF stands for. Of course, I forget at this point. But the PAF is the form that documents the cost estimate and the financial needs for the project. And so a PAF that's commensurate with a project that's being co-optimized will again identify the other projects that have an opportunity to be done concurrently. And so those PAFs are submitted to Pura on an annual basis. The PAF follows the SSF. The SSF is more technical, the PAF is more financial, but it does have information about, it's a project authorization form. That's where it's going. So the project authorization form that we submit every year would have that co-optimization information also.
Thank you for your responses, Mr. Freeman. I will let Chair Gillette move on with the other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Stephanie Beeler.
Yes, thank you, Chair Gillette. Stephanie Beeler with RMI. My question is pertaining to a table on slide 17. If it's possible to pull that up. So yes, so on the table on slide 17, the two likely non-wire solutions solicitation opportunities both didn't proceed with the proposed RFI. I was wondering if it was possible to explain why those two projects didn't proceed, and more broadly, what is the barrier that most frequently prevents non-wire solutions from moving forward in the screening process?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you for that question. I think that's a two-part question. In terms of the table on the right-hand side, that's a screenshot out of a sample from the Pura order. So these aren't actual projects. This was provided by Pura as a sample of how this might look like. So no projects to discuss here. What's most likely? Well, there's a couple of reasons why NWAs typically fail. What we've seen, the most viable NWAs are those where you have, we're talking capacity, a minimal capacity need that triggers a relatively expensive system upgrade, where with a minimum effort of a non-wires alternative, you can defer those upgrades. NWAs scale pretty significantly cost-wise the larger the deficit gets. Right? So if we're talking multiple megawatt sizes, That's where the non-wires alternatives typically scale very expensively. Whereas, for example, a substation upgrade, if you're, I'm making up numbers, but if you're going from a 40 to a 62 MVA transformer, 62.5 MVAs are standard transformer sizes. We're going to go to that transformer size. That's the next step, regardless of how much that is. So if you need 20 megawatts, that's very, it gets very hard for the non-wires alternative to compete because that battery scales up in price the bigger the deficit is. So what we've seen is typically those that have a relatively high cost compared to a relatively low need work best for non-wires alternatives. What's also depending on this is highly dependent on the technology, right? And I'm sorry if I'm picking on the batteries a bit, but especially, for example, for batteries is running costs of the systems, maintenance, and then life expectancy compared to a traditional upgrade, right? So normal transformer, it's 40 to 60 years, a battery 12 to 20. So that's why we always talk about deferral, right? Because after the maximum deferral is the lifespan of the asset of the NWA, which is typically shorter than that of the traditional asset. And at that point, at the end of lifespan, we would have to reevaluate. So if you're looking at the deferral value, because the risk is that you have to upgrade anyways, that has a diminishing impact on the value of the NWA compared to a traditional solution. Those are typically the two things we see. And the last item is always just from a planning standpoint, is non-wires are geared to the need at hand, right? For example, if you have a half a megawatt capacity deficit, nobody here would argue we should deploy a 5 megawatt battery, right? That's overkill for that capacity deficit. But that also means that, you know, say electrification goes a little bit faster than expected, the expected impact of that non-wires gets diminished really quickly, even if it is deployed, because that capacity it grants the system gets used up a lot faster. So because they are geared to exactly to meet what they needed and not above, because costs are incremental to capacity, you want to be as close as possible to your need. Otherwise, you get too expensive. They leave very little room for additional load growth above and beyond what's projected.
All right, thank you.
So one example I can put, Mr. Freeman is probably the better person to talk to this one, but like one example, the company's, the P-Town battery that the company deployed on the Cape is a very good example of something like this, where there was tremendous costs on the traditional system upgrade side, which were offsettable by a battery.
That's correct. Not only cost, but also having to run a transmission line through a national seashore area. So there was both economic costs and political and societal costs, which made the battery a much more tenable solution. But based on technical costs alone, it was viable.
Okay, thank you. I will turn it back to Chair Gillette.
Thank you. And last but not least, Attorney Wheel, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I raised my hand first and then I backed off because I didn't want OCC to dominate all the questions. But and this may have been sort of addressed, but I just wanted to make sure. From the presentation, it sounded like I heard the companies describe the process of considering non-wire solutions for kind of bridge or temporary solutions. Is that generally how the company sees non-wire solutions, as being temporary or sort of bridge solutions, or was that commentary just specific to to scenarios where there's a reason to implement a temporary solution?
Well, let me. That's a loaded question. It's a lot of detail to that. So there are, of course, scenarios where a non-wires alternative might defer the need past the forecasting horizon. Right? If our forecast horizon is 10 years and you manage to deploy a non-wires solution that obfuscates the need in the next 10 years, you've deferred it out of the forecasting horizon. Now, beyond that, I can't tell you if in year 13, 14, or 15, load jumps and no longer works. So at that point, we'll have to reevaluate. And so it's a deferral until then. But since I don't have that timeline, because nobody with any accuracy can predict past 10 years, that's an open-ended question. However, given that we're all striving to an electrified grid with a lot more electric vehicles and heat pumps, I'm willing to make a prediction that we're going to see a significant load growth over the next 3 decades, be that driven through electric vehicles or heat pumps or any other technology that might evolve. So with that regard, and back to the question from Ms. Bieler earlier on about what the best NWAs is, we would size an NWA to meet the known need in the 10 years, right? Say that's 0.5 megawatt, and you size it to it. Because again, you wouldn't deploy a 2 megawatt battery. And again, I'm picking on the batteries here, but any technology, because you have an incremental cost above the 0.5 megawatt what you're trying to achieve, which weighs heavily on the BCA for the non-wires alternative. So you wouldn't do that. You would go for the 0.5 megawatt because that's the optimum BCA for the asset at hand. Electrification would just redo that. So that's one thought on this. The other thought is that if you have giving you an example again, if you have a substation that you need to upgrade and you're like, okay, I'm going to do an NWA and it works, I'm going to buy a battery that's good, that reduces the need for the substation upgrade. At some point, those transformers are going to be so old they need to get replaced. But there's an end of life expectancy on the transformers at some point. And if you have to go replace them with, at that point, standard equipment, that standard equipment might just be the next class transformer, which is a 62.5 transformer, totally taking out the need for the non-wires alternative. And if you're doing the calculation, then the BCA changes, because now, even if you need to increase the transformer size, your incremental cost to the project you have to do anyways, because your substation is literally falling apart, it's just an incremental capacity cost to it. So that's the end of the NWA's useful expected support in this. At the most, it gets you to end of life asset on the traditional grid. And then you have to reevaluate. So it's a very long answer to a question, but the long and short of it is, yes, we look at it from a deferral value, because we can't guarantee that it will forever reduce the need for an upgrade. And we know for a fact that at the time of end of life for the traditional asset, we're going to be there to have to replace that, because no non-wires alternative replaces entire substation, right? You still need a connection to the power system.
Thanks.
Sorry, long answer.
No, it's helpful. Just as a follow-up, how is it any different from traditional system planning, though, with respect to like sizing to load for what you know now with the the first part of your question, of your response, where you were talking about how you sort of build to what the demand is now. Is it different for a not for a traditional solution? I'm just trying to understand what the distinction there is.
So I'll let Mr. Freeman start answering this one, and I think that falls squarely in his wheelhouse.
Yes, it is very different traditional project. When we are designing a traditional project for load, we do understand how load is growing in the area, and we do understand that step loads can occur. A 500 kilowatt to 1 megawatt load or more can pop up suddenly. And so when we are designing the system, we're designing with a buffer. Typically, our standard is that on the normal operations, the substation transformer should not be loaded more than 75% of its rated capacity. And on the emergency conditions, it should be no more than 90% of its rated capacity. Then we begin to plan for another substation. And then a key point to note is that our assets that we deploy are standard size assets. So if we are overloaded on a transformer, for example, and we need to upgrade the transformer, if it's a 20 MVA transformer or a 47 MVA transformer, the next size is a 62.5 MVA transformer. So we're not going to put in a 25 MVA transformer go from a 20 to 25. We'll go from a 20 to a 62.5. And there are very good reasons why the company standardizes on transformers, and we'll get into that here. Suffice it to say, it saves us money to have standard transformer sizes. But those, again, create additional capacity and a buffer against future load growth, electrification, step loads. And I'll let Dr. Walker supplement.
Yeah, I think the key point is the standard sizes on the traditional, and a battery you can almost infinitely granularly scale, right, how big you're going to make that battery. Transformers don't come in that scale, right? There's certain sizes that manufacturers carry and that we purchase as standard sizes. So, and that's what I mentioned earlier with the which projects are the most cost effective for non-wires alternatives, right? Because to what Mr. Freeman said, if you're upgrading the transformer and let's say that gives you a 40 megawatt jumping capacity, that's the next smallest one you can deploy. You have 40 megawatts of spare capacity that you've paid for with that transformer. But if the NWA has an advantage if it's a small violation because it only needs to be scaled very small towards that. If batteries only came in 10 megawatt increments, we would have exactly the same situation, right? If you think of a world where batteries only came in 10 megawatt increments, we would be in exactly the same situation that was for the traditional planning.
Thank you. I have so much more to ask, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. Thanks for the opportunity, Chairman.
I think we'll have another opportunity next week too.
Very true. All right. Well, then thank you very much to all of our presenters, both for your presentation, for addressing our questions. We will let you off the hot seat for now, but we'll see many of you back next week. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move into our next presentation, which is by the Office of Consumer Counsel. Attorney Wheel, would you like us to control the slides, or do you plan to?
Yes, please. If Miss Lupley, I think it's Miss Lupley today. Yes, complete. Thank you. Hi, good morning. Tom Wheel for the Office of Consumer Counsel. You can go to the next slide, which is just our introduction slide. I'm the Director of Utility Oversight and Regulatory Reform, and the people who are actually going to say things that are smart and matter today are Alex Walmsley and Stephanie Beeler from RMI. So I am going to pass the presentation along to them, and I will be back at the end to talk about questions and conclusions. So I think Alex or Stephanie, I'm not sure, I forget who goes first, but passing it off to you.
Let me jump in. Yeah, thank you. If you could move on a slide. Okay, so the overall concept here is not to dive into the detail on things which are being discussed in the working group, or sort of essentially to rehash some of the things that have gone through in RE07. Instead, it's an overall kind of commentary on some of the processes framed within the PBR structure, like where is this meeting some of the PBR priority outcomes? How does that itself kind of roll into IDSP? So taking, I suppose, a more structural view on how some of this work, particularly with non-wire solution, essentially is kind of nested within the PBR work, and how it relates back to the kind of the broader regulatory framework and processes. So we're going to talk about some of those specific priority outcomes, the overview of some of the processes and technical considerations, give some view on the sourcing and how some of those processes can really, make sure they're getting the best out of the opportunities that are out there, and then kind of lead back in with the performance mechanisms and how it kind of loops in and gives that kind of structural view for non-wire solutions and PBR. If you could move on a slide, please. Okay, so supporting priority outcomes, you can see, clearly IDSP fitting some of the priority state goals and priorities, consumer needs, and the evolution of the grid edge. This is Mr. Palladino discussing how this all essentially fits together. But what I've done is sort of pulled out some of the priority outcomes as discussed under PBR, and really saw how non-wire solutions, does go into business operations, how the business works and how it fits together, comprehensive and transparent processes, and really thinking about how these things can be made clear. Utilization of the distribution system and resiliency are some of the clear benefits of non-wire solutions, as well as affordable service, those which are put through in bold. And to give the kind of the overview, yes, we're looking at cost savings, particularly through things like the avoidance of deferral and the flexible approach. I mean, the idea that non-wire solutions can be flexible, as just discussed there by Dr. Walker, the idea that you can essentially kind of scale some of these quite differently to traditional solutions, and they can evolve through time, as well as the idea that you have a kind of competitive downward pressure on some of the prices, and how those can enable competitive solicitation to bring forward the best kind of solutions. And then we can see there are additional wider benefits within the grid services realm. So as well as capacity, some of these feature or can provide broader grid services, things like ancillary services, as well as broader environmental benefits. Now, we could move on a slide. Okay, so the identification process. We have this kind of nice flowchart. This was pulled from Con Ed and their overall process. And I suppose it covers quite a lot of what was discussed by UI and Eversource on their presentation, particularly the identification, I suppose, and thinking about some of the scales. Now, as discussed, there is this idea that the higher the value of the non-wire solutions, the more the kind of the margin, I suppose, or the marginal benefit increases of the non-wire solutions. But we can see some variations in thresholds that have been considered and how those have been applied in different states, as well as thinking about the timing and the time horizon. I understand 36 months is sort of what's been put through in the non-wire solutions work. Some of those are essentially, some are saying 24 months. So there is a kind of a range there, I suppose, of options on what be taken forwards. The key points here, I suppose, are that the process itself, like each of these boxes, needs to be as transparent as possible, not just for regulators and being able to understand what has been done and why, but also for potential non-wire solutions providers to be able to say, yes, that's where we are in the process, and I know what might be coming around, or perhaps I can provide a solution in a number of years in a particular location because I can see the kind of analysis which is being done. So the transparency element and the transparency priority outcome as a key element here to be able to expand the range and the number of solutions that are coming forwards, and essentially to facilitate that. And then clearly this is an important requirement for IDSP. If we could move on again, please. So this is a slightly different take on the decision process. It's a decision tree which has come from National Grid's electricity distribution, and they run what they refer to as a distribution networks options assessment annually. And you kind of have these different stepwise processes, and a big benefit of this is that this is run for essentially every substation and put out in a big report, so that if you're a non-wire solutions provider or a virtual power plant, you can see for every substation, is it green, yellow, orange, black, or red, right? Is this something where, yes, I know that in this particular location, there is a requirement now, there might be a requirement in the future, or there is literally no requirement for a non-wire solution. So that kind of highly navigable, easy to understand signposting is designed, in part for ease of use and processes, but really for the providers to be able to say, yes, I know what's coming down the road, and I will be there or be able to offer and increase, I suppose, the liquidity of offerings, because some of the lack of what's coming forward, some of the lack of the competitive pressure is in part because there's insufficient visibility and transparency on what is actually required, where and when. And so you have these decision processes from left to right. Like, is this a constrained area which requires an intervention at all? Yes or no? If it's not, like, literally don't worry about it. Is it one where there is actually a screening, I suppose, that it could be managed using, you know, what they term flexibility, essentially a non-wise solution? Yes or no? If not, if there's no option, go ahead and you reinforce, use a traditional process. Will this be required within the next year? If yes, kind of carry on forward. And if not, you could say, well, you know, year after that, give a view. And then you have this concept of reinforce with flexibility. Those are ones where it's essentially the same as the bridge to wires, right? The idea that you want to reinforce, but you physically can't build fast enough. So you need some temporary solution to be able to get there. Or is it one where you can have a longer, more enduring solution for a deferral? Perhaps you reach that 10-year window as discussed, perhaps longer. So a helpful way to conceptualize some of this work. If you could move us on a slide. Great. Okay. So requirements include, you know, the technical processes. We have heard from the EDCs about some of the more kind of granular processes. So this is perhaps more cursory, but the main point to focus on here is the need for granularity across timing, frequency, and amplitude. Like how big, how much, how often, and where, and being able to do that as part of the IDSP process. So you have this kind of annual update set and the cadence at which that can be done. Some of these are done on a more regular process, some of those on a less regular process, and there's some examples here. But really, the IDSP process should be able to feed in at a granular level what is required, where and when. And you can see this example from Hawaii basically saying, yes, between the hours of 5 and 11, for a set amount of days, this is what is needed, and being able to go into that level of detail in order to then go for RFP and procurement processes. You need to be able to have that, you know, it's good data in, good data out, essentially. Like if you've got the planning process going in at a granular level, you can start to make these kind of assessments. Obviously, that is contingent, again, on the level of detail, the length of the forecast needed to identify these items. New York looking at 10 years and 5 years elsewhere as well. So your analysis is important. I suppose that's the key here. Good data in, good data out. If we could move on a slide. Okay, so solution sourcing. This is where you're either going to market or going to RFP, some kind of route to find solutions for non-wise solutions, solutions for solutions. I think you hopefully get my drift. The process for solution sourcing needs to have some flexibility within it. The process can be so long in time that by the time you reach your 24 or 36 month window, what you actually need might have changed. And this is something that we've seen in a number of states. And you almost kind of regret having asked for perhaps too little of a requirement, or that requirement shifts because there's additional load growth as you're halfway through. And so having sufficient flexibility to be able to accommodate changes in requirements is really helpful. Again, being clear on the evaluation process. You know, I was asking about co-optimization. Part of that rationale is, are there other things going on in a particular area, or are there elements that could allow for a provider to be able to say, yeah, you know, I can actually help this situation and show up in a way because I understand how that's going to be evaluated. And again, thinking about all of the range of benefits that a non-wise solutions can bring. There are of course, across those priority outcomes, bill affordability, but also are there environmental benefits? How are those factored in? And how is that all pulled together in the overall evaluation process as transparently as possible? The box below, thinking about non-wise solutions providers, think about it through their feet, I guess, through their shoes. What do they need in order to be able to bring forward the best possible range of solutions? So if you're a non-wise solution provider, do you want to be potentially locked into a long-term contract? There is a question mark here whether some non-wise solutions providers really benefit from being able to say, yeah, I'm going to be available for 5 years or 10 years, and that's an attractive kind of enduring process. And there are those which might be more readily available on a shorter term basis. You know, I can be available on a more compact time horizon. Again, the next point is about specificity versus neutrality of the technologies themselves. You know, whether an EDC goes out and says, well, I need this to be a particular type of storage or a particular type of solar or a particular type of whatever it may be, versus those which are more agnostic. And generally, you're likely to see more options come forward in a technology agnostic type approach. And then we do see this example where people are DER providers, non-wise solution providers, find themselves perhaps unable to meet their obligation. So I've said, yes, I will be able to provide this non-wise solution, but in fact, you know, they were unable to acquire sufficient customers to be able to provide it, for instance, or there might have been an aggregation issue. One of the concepts which is perhaps more advanced or kind of future facing is this idea around secondary trading. So if there's an obligation to provide a non-wise solution which falls through, is there a means facilitated through the regulatory process and through the utility process to enable a secondary trade to be able to say, actually, another party is going to fulfill my obligation? The key thing for all of these is around stakeholder engagement. You know, knowing what providers actually are able to offer, what they're willing to offer, what kind of prices are out there, and being able to engage in this non-wise solutions market, as it were, in a meaningful way to be able to essentially, it's like a partnership thinking. We're not just saying, oh, they didn't show up, or, oh, I did this process and no one was there. It's more like, how do we work with industry outside of utilities, with utilities, to be able to find mechanisms that bring forward as many solutions in a competitive means as possible. And then the box over on the right discusses some of the more kind of innovative technologies. There is obviously the UI PICLO process, the Innovative Energy Solutions Program, looking at how do you develop a kind of an intermediary. That's, again, a really exciting proposition. There are, of course, regulatory issues to think about. You know, does that create an extra cost in the process? Do you end up with some kind of technology interoperability issues? So it's not a kind of silver bullet, but it could assist with some of the solution sourcing. Okay, if we could move on to the performance mechanism slide. Knowing whether these issues work, knowing whether non-wise solutions are doing a good job, and Mr. Kramer made a similar question on this. I suppose there's certainly the proposal out in REO2 for a metric covering avoided cost and being able to see what actually happened. Did you avoid a set of costs, and how does that feed into the overall kind of business transparency, efficient, I forget the exact wording of the first priority outcome, but around business efficiency. And that clearly loops back into this overall process. The other one which I've put on there is this idea of measuring the delta between what an RFP seeks and what actually is available, and trying to narrow that based on feedback. So as part of comprehensive transparent planning, understanding what was actually able to show up and provide non-wise solutions, how can that learning feed into the solution sourcing process around continuous process improvement. And so I think that's certainly something which is worth considering, reporting and how that can be improved. And then finally, not on this slide, but covered, I think, in some of the like cost revenue slides from earlier, was about the shared savings mechanism around consumer costs saved, and the 25% consumer or shared savings mechanism process, and how that feeds back in to the overall conceptual idea around PBR, and how the incentives there can align between the utilities and our overall policy framework. So those slides essentially cover the non-wise solution process at a relatively structural level, and give some examples and some pointers about how these elements can be drawn together. What I wanted to do briefly on the following slide, if we can move on. So this is your bonus slide. This one is going slightly beyond non-wise solutions only, and thinking about how some of the concepts within non-wise solutions can be perhaps broader than they might first appear. And so this, I see a clear link between non-wise solutions and the concept of flexible interconnection, in that both of these are about managing where and when to build grid upgrades effectively as part of the planning process. And both of them are leveraging DER control, I suppose, to do so. With a non-wise solution, you have a interconnected party already who is perhaps compensated a certain amount for asset control. With flexible interconnection, you have a not yet interconnected party who can manage some of the grid requirements, but the compensation mechanism is essentially the other way around. You have a party who might be able to connect in advance of a grid upgrade in exchange for giving up some control of their asset to the utility, and as a consequence, being curtailed for certain periods. So the DERs, in both senses, provide some service and grid service that impacts on where and when grid apparatus is built. But it's essentially the other side of the same coin between a non-wise solution and a flexible interconnection in how they both operate. And again, both require load forecasting, both require screening, both require quite a lot of the granular data analysis on where and when different things are happening across the grid. And I suppose from an OCC perspective, are really worth considering in this overall IDSP process. There are obviously regulatory considerations. You want to know that curtailment is sufficiently transparent around how often, where, and when interconnecting parties might be curtailed. So certainly a range of regulatory considerations as well. But there are some examples of this in nearby states and some of the similar utilities as well. So that's my bonus add there to kind of discuss flexible interconnection as well. Now, hopefully that's given you a good overview of some of the non-wise solution challenges and some of the issues out there. I'm going to turn back to Tom Wheel at OCC to close us out, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And with that, OCC is open to questions from authority staff or the authority or anyone else. Thanks.
Thank you. We will start with questions from Mr. Kramer, and I'll encourage any other stakeholders that might have questions regarding the OCC's presentation to enter the queue by using the raise hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. And we will get to those questions after authority staff.
Thank you, Chairman Gillette, and thank you to RMI and OCC for the presentation. Just a few questions for me. First, Mr. Walmsley, you started in some of your early slides discussing the importance of transparency and looking at the various outcomes that both distribution system planning and the non-wires solutions process can advance. And in thinking about transparency, you certainly spoke to the importance of ensuring that developers or solution providers have the information they need to be responsive to various procurements and meet grid needs. I'm curious, based on the prior presentation from the EDCs, where they spoke to the quarterly stakeholder meetings that are planned for the non-wire solutions process when it's up and running in 2025. I'm curious if RMI or the OCC have a perspective on who should be involved in those stakeholder meetings, sort of any other stakeholders other than developers and providers. I think those are an obvious constituency that you spoke to, but are there other stakeholders that in your research on this topic or experience in this topic you would recommend be participating in those quarterly meetings in the future?
Thank you for the question. I suppose the first comment is that the stakeholder meetings themselves should, I guess, iterate and continuously improve as they go through. Like, is there the right level of feedback coming back? What needs to change to make those as effective as possible? Now, with regard to stakeholders, I think there is, as well as your perhaps more typical developers, there is some grounds for some of the OEMs, some of the sort of technology specific type providers who are increasingly kind of active in this space as, I'm thinking like EV manufacturers, people who are making the charge point manufacturers, those kind of groups. Equally, I would suggest there is possibly some grounds for some of the groups who are, advising as well. I'm not looking for an invite, don't worry. It's I'm thinking that some of the groups who are advising utilities on this, some of the like third-party consultants who are in the space of actually doing some of the calculations and some of the like you see some avoided cost calculators, the people behind those to be able to understand what's the best set of options there. I would also comment that there is probably space for our work with OCC. I think OCC are a group to look at consumer protections specifically to non-wire solutions, so that parties are getting the best deal, I suppose, and the consumer benefit is passed on from non-wire solutions to the endpoint consumer, and that consumers are essentially well protected in any issues that might arise.
Thank you. And I ask not because we seek to establish in this docket the invite list or the agendas for those meetings that will happen separately, but instead because it is likely that the same stakeholders that may be engaged in those working groups would have an interest in the distribution system planning process, as that feeds directly into the non-wires processes we've discussed today. Okay, thank you. My second question is around the national grid decision tree that you shared. I think it's slide 6.
Slide 6, yeah.
Yes. And my question here is around, so is this for National Grid UK, or which National Grid jurisdiction uses this particular framework?
National Grid Electricity Distribution is an EDC in the UK. It is the same parent group as the Massachusetts EDC.
Thank you. And could you, I think maybe you addressed part of my second question here in a subsequent slide, which was going to be how frequently this is updated, but I believe you indicated it's annually. So if you could confirm that this is updated annually, but then also sort of in what forum it's made public and how it is used publicly.
Yeah, so this is an annual document that goes shared with webinars and a launch event as a, it's a helpful glossy document that gets published, and it is targeted at a similar list to the stakeholder group we were just talking about, and particularly trying to get those providers and technology firms to be able to see what is out there in order to provide solutions. There is a link on the slides as well, which kind of links through, and it's a big table essentially of every substation out there and a description of what is happening, like how long its asset life is likely to be, its asset health condition. It's those kind of metrics in a public fora to be able to indicate to, I guess, anyone who wants to read it what might be required in a specific location.
Thank you. That's helpful. And a related question then, you on a slide subsequent to this, this one regarding the National Grid decision tree, you gave some examples of the frequency with which distribution system plan documents are produced, I think showing 3 years in New York, maybe it was 5 years in Michigan, if I'm recalling accurately. I'm curious with the reporting cycles for those examples, or any other jurisdictions that you're aware of. Have you seen relationships between an IDSP filing and rate cases? And if so, what does that relationship look like in any other jurisdictions where you're aware of that?
Yeah, let me think through. So I am not as aware, I'm afraid. I don't have a perfect answer for you on this, on the direct relationship between the overall process and how that cadence aligns. It is one where we could go and dig some more information out and provide this as a follow-up if that would be helpful. But I don't feel fully prepared to kind of lay my cards down on exactly which cadence it will be, I'm afraid.
Understood. Yeah, what I'm getting at here with the question is simply whether there is a relationship, right? If what you've seen in other jurisdictions is that those are fixed timelines, or whether there is some flexibility around trying to sync some of these filings up with a rate case when that's filed for a given EDC within that jurisdiction, given that the information included in a distribution system plan and the resulting capital investment plan is likely very relevant to the request that's at hand for a given rate case. So that's just the nature of what I'm seeking to understand is other jurisdictions and how they bring the distribution system planning process into a rate case.
It's certainly it's a great question, and yeah, I'm afraid I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. I do think that those which are listed, so New York and Michigan, their cadence is, I think, more set than the cadence at which a rate case is going to come up. So I think there is almost a kind of an expectation that they're on a cycle, whereas some of the wider processes can be more variable. However, again, that's not a particularly firm answer. I think if we can provide some more input and research, that would be the best way to take this one forwards.
Thank you. And with that, Chairman Gillette, those are the questions that I had for OCC and RMI. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll do a last call for questions on this presentation. I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue right now. All right, if not, Mr. Walmsley, Attorney Wheel, thank you very much for the presentation, answering our questions, and we will look forward to learning more on that last round of questions from you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we do have space on our agenda now, as always, for any open discussion items. We don't have anything specific to ask about, but wanted to provide space if stakeholders have any general questions or more appropriately comments at this time, specifically on today's meeting topic. Okay, if not, then I'll just oh, Mr. Walmsley.
Hi again. Right. Thank you, Chair Gillette. So we had a few things that might be useful to discuss. I suppose there is now a period of less meetings coming through until September for the concept paper and then the subsequent straw paper. I guess my question is, like, within that process, is the output of that concept paper likely to look like a series of standards recommendations? Is that something which is kind of being aimed at in order that we can perhaps provide the right level of input from OCC's perspective?
Sure. It is a staff concept paper, so let me ask Mr. Kramer to advise.
Certainly. Thank you, Chair Gillette. And Mr. Walmsley, to your question on the staff concept paper, at this point, the intent is to synthesize and reflect the information that we've all been walking through with this series of technical meetings to date, to really capture the existing distribution system planning process as has been discussed in this docket. It is not something that has been as sort of consolidated in a single place within a docket previously, and we're aiming to capture that through the concept paper. And I would just add, in addition to documenting the process as the EDCs have conveyed it to us, also, I think, start to express some potential ideas for the vision, right, of what it could look like, what we've heard from some of the questioning, what RMI and OCC have put forth, some other ideas to say directionally where might it be helpful to dig further into various aspects of the distribution system planning process. So that concept paper is really about what exists and some notions of where to dig further. You also mentioned the straw proposal, and I think stepping ahead to that point, we would expect to conduct some additional discovery and have additional engagement and feedback with participants before getting to that straw, where that would be more intended to discuss specific ideas or recommendations for modification or change to the process, and maybe also start to identify some characteristics of the plan itself, the IDSP plan and process themselves, as reflected by the discussion and nature of this docket.
Okay, thank you for the further detail on what we can expect. Hopefully stakeholders on the call saw OCC published put forward a memo that covers quite a lot of kind of how these things link back to some of the PBR priority outcomes. So I guess the first offer is, in this stakeholder discussion, if anyone had anything from there that they wanted to ask about or discuss, we're more than happy to kind of dive into that if that would be helpful for anyone on the call. And then the second point is, yeah, hopefully that can kind of be used as part of not be used, but to inform some of the like IDSP processes meeting policy objectives and sort of really tying those things together. And I suppose a question to the group, how can these plans be reviewed in order to pull IDSP and PBR together and synthesize those? So I guess an offer and a question to the group.
Mr. Walmsley, I'll say if folks aren't prepared to engage on that today, I know certainly that PIRA has, that we've seen it and probably will need to issue discovery on it. And I don't think we're we're not personally prepared to engage today, but we'll definitely follow up. So
No problem. Yeah, offer is there. Yeah, sounds good.
awesome. If there are any stakeholders on today that did want to take Mr. Walmsley up on the offer today, happy to provide space for that. Okay. All right, Mr. Walmsley, anything else?
Not from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, if not, we had a couple of really great presentations and dialogue today. So I want to thank everyone for your active engagement in this morning's technical meeting. I think that brings us to the end of our agenda. In terms of next steps, we've already sufficiently discussed that. So I will ask everyone to keep an eye on the external calendar for any additional information or date information. And with that, I think we can bring it to a close and wish everyone a good rest of the day.